Pioneer brand canola with Optimum Gly, the highest yielding glyphosate tolerant trait on the market. What's next in canola happens here.
Bernard Tobin here at the Farm Progress Show in Boone, Iowa. I am catching up now with Karl Wyant. He's the Director of Agronomy for Nutrien Premium Fertilizer Solutions. Karl, how's it going? What do you think of the show?
This is my third time at the Farm Progress Show. I did Iowa two years ago, went to Illinois last year, and now back in Iowa. Great to get out, great to see all the people at the Nutrien Premium Fertilizer Products tent. We've been handing out popsicles, and we have two flavors, pineapple and lime. Pineapple is the absolute crowd favorite. Yeah, but I think as we transition into a hot, humid afternoon, that lime does taste a little bit like a margarita. I think that's might be come up first here as the heat comes in.
Well, when we wrap this up, I'm going to head over and take you up on that. Hey, but before that, I'm going to take we're going to talk sulfur. Not as appetizing, but a lot of importance attached to it for these growers. And you know, it's something that you work put a lot of time into working on. And I want to talk about the need for sulfur and finding the right formulation. A lot of focus on sulfur in recent years. Why?
Yeah, the sulfur piece is really emerging as the fourth macronutrient. So nitrogen, phosphate, potassium, that's taken a lot of time and attention. Now sulfur is becoming recognized as a key partner in a growing operation because we're getting less free sulfur out of the air. We've cleaned up the air with various pollution acts in Canada and the United States. Some parts of Ontario, some parts of the Great Lakes region of the United States used to get 30 pounds an acre of free sulfur a year, just coming down from the air. That's a lot of free fertilizer. Of course, it came with a pollution price. So as we've gotten rid of the pollution, we've gotten rid of that free sulfur source. Now we're down to some areas where we're getting 1 or 2 pounds, and it's not enough to actually feed the crop, so we're seeing more deficiencies. And that's where growers are coming to us and saying, hey, how do we recognize sulfur deficiency, and how do I build it into my fertilizer management strategy so that I can make a plan and be successful in the cropping season.
And the other thing about it is, we're seeing yields sort of push higher and higher and higher. The crops, need more sulfur.
Yeah, when we put in these pollution controls, particularly for sulfur, it was 1990. If you think about where your yield is here now in 2024, much higher yields on your farm. You're pulling more sulfur out of the soil. Your crop's demanding more sulfur during the season. Meanwhile, that sulfur coming down from the sky, not there anymore. So you're pulling on your soils for more sulfur, and that's where growers are seeing success by integrating sulfur into their nutrient management plan.
Tell me about what sulfur does for the plant.
Sure. One way we can start to think about sulfur is what the deficiency symptom looks like, and that's yellowing on the plant, generally on the top part of the plant. If you're thinking about a corn plant, we are here in Iowa. Corn is always on the mind of everybody. So we have this corn plant turning yellow. That's telling you that sulfur has a big role in chlorophyll, and that's the pigment that takes all this sunshine and converts it into energy that a plant can actually use to build biomass, build yield, build root systems. And so when you don't have this sulfur, you can't make the chlorophyll, your plant is not as green. So it's really part of that energy metabolism of a plant. Another big piece, you mentioned the appetizing piece earlier, garlic and onions. Sulfur is a part of that flavor compound that makes a garlic and an onion taste like they're supposed to. And so if you just think about the next meal you're preparing, sulfur fertilizer, sulfur nutrition, a key part of that flavor profile you're trying to serve your guests.
What about a crop like corn? When we hit the optimum levels, how can we sort of push yield? What type of result can we see?
So, and I think one thing growers are looking for is I've got my nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium plan. We've been doing that for years. Where is the next sort of increase on my farm in yield going to come from? And that's where folks have been finding sulfur is a nutrient they need to bring in. For all the reasons I mentioned earlier, with less pollution, more demand, but finding this kind of easy to integrate win into an operation to find more bushels per acre on the farm. And that's where we've seen some of our extension research that shows, on corn, on sulfur deficient soils in Indiana, where they're getting an average increase of 11 to 13 bushels an acre just by bringing in the sulfur component. So it can be a low-hanging fruit. In some areas where they've been using sulfur for a long time, maybe on a canola type crop that's super hungry for sulfur, kind of changing up the form of the sulfur has been the win, because they're matching how that sulfur behaves in soil, avoiding the leaching, and maybe getting some more, keeping that sulfur around longer so the crop can use it.
Let's talk about organic matter and the role that can play in making more sulfur accessible to the crop, and I guess part of that conversation is soil type as well, right?
Yeah, so your soil type and your organic matter level specifically. Organic matter has a big pool of sulfur in it. It's one of your biggest soil pools of sulfur. You need microbes to kind of chew through that organic matter and release the sulfate into the soil so the plants can take it up. So the more organic matter you have, you've got a long, warm growing season with adequate soil moisture, and you've got an active microbial population. All good kind of checklists to have to ensure timely sulfur release to the crop. Now, if you don't have one of those, then it gets tough. Cold, wet soils, over wet or over dry, cool soils, low organic matter, and this is where your soil type and where your geography really starts to play a role. If you're in those low organic matters, those 1% organic matters, 2%, and even lower, you can struggle with sulfur nutrition. And if you have a microbial population that's depressed and lower than it should be, maybe that's when it's time to think about, well, how do I increase the biological part of my soil to help with that sulfur cycle.
Always talking about the 4 R's of nutrient stewardship. How do we apply that to sulfur from a grower's perspective? That time, place, rate, and source.
Yeah, so if you think about sulfur, your plant can only take it up in the sulfate form. And so that gives you kind of these options on formulation, and there's pros and cons to each. Sulfate, things like gypsum, calcium sulfate, iron sulfate, potassium sulfate, fertilizers you can put out that include that sulfate component that can be taken up readily. So ammonium sulfate's a popular option. The challenge with having that sulfate readily available is that if you get any rain or snow melt over the top, you can leach it out of your soil. So there's the pro, readily available. There's the con, it's readily leachable. So you can go to other types of sulfur, particularly elemental sulfur, which doesn't leach. It just kind of hangs out in the soil until the microbes chew on it and oxidize that elemental sulfur into sulfate, which can be taken up by the plant. And so you resist the leaching with the elemental sulfur. The challenge is making sure that release curve coincides with your plant's demand for the crop. So you just got to make sure that elemental sulfur is releasing properly.
Yeah. And speaking about building on timing, micronized sulfur, MAP plus MST. How can that help manage the timing element of managing sulfur?
So we have a great granular product, Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST, 9-34-0-16S. So the 16S is that sulfur component that growers are so excited about. And a large chunk of that S is elemental sulfur. And we've also made it very small. So the MST is micronized sulfur technology. And what that allows the microbes to do is that once they wake up in the spring, they can get at that sulfur more and release that elemental sulfur more quickly, oxidize it, and make sure that it actually coincides with crop uptake. So if you put it down in the fall, which is a super popular option, the elemental piece, because the microbes are sleepy and dormant, it resists that oxidation, it resists the leaching from snow melt and rainfall. But once the soil's warm back up and the microbes get going, the smaller particle size really lets that process happen much more quickly because those particles are more accessible to the microbes and more uniformly through the season.
Hey, some final thoughts for growers out there listening. Any tips for recognizing sulfur deficient soils and how growers can plan to fix them?
I think one great place to start is your own observations. Where it's August right now. If you've had some summer rains hit your ground, maybe you've got some soils that don't have a lot of organic matter in them to begin with, and maybe have aren't these deep black soils like we're standing on here in Iowa at Farm Progress Show. One thing to think about is just your observations. Am I seeing those symptoms of deficiency? The yellowing of the corn on the top, yellowing soybeans, yellowing canola, perhaps. So thinking about your deficiencies, thinking about what you're seeing, and then building that team of advisors around you to say, like, let's identify what's causing the problem, soil sampling, tissue sampling, sometimes just planning an experiment, like we're going to run strips of a sulfur material through a field. Or I saw in Ontario a guy that he forgot to put the sulfur in, and he ran accidental strips and saw the yellowing because he forgot it, which was a great way to okay, the sulfur's doing the job. So your own observation is a great place to start. I mentioned the soil testing, just seeing what does my soil look like? What does the organic matter look like? What are the levels of the sulfur? And what's my crop demand for sulfurs? Canola's very sulfur hungry. Forage crops are sulfur hungry. I mentioned the garlic and the onions. If you've ever had really poorly tasting garlic and onions, maybe they need some sulfur in the plan, right? And then you've got some crops that are lighter feeders, and that thing that's talking with your local agronomist about what is your cropping plan, what's that sulfur demand look like, and making a plan for them.
Well, Karl, hey, appreciate you taking some time for Real Agriculture here at the Farm Progress Show. Some great insights on sulfur. Hey, how about you and I grab a popsicle?
Hey, sounds good. I'm gonna try the lime one. I needed that margarita.
Good stuff. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.